Picture this. A monk's scream pierces the midnight silence of a monastery. But this isn't a cry of spiritual ecstasy or divine revelation. This is the sound of pure terror, echoing through stone corridors that have witnessed unspeakable horrors for centuries. What if I told you that behind the sacred walls where men claim to serve God, the most unholy acts imaginable were taking place? Murder, torture, sexual abuse, and corruption so vile that it would make your blood run cold. You think you know about medieval monasteries? Think again, because what you're about to discover will shatter every romanticized notion you've ever had about these so-called holy sanctuaries. Stay with me, because we're about to descend into the darkest chapter of medieval history, where wolves disguised themselves as shepherds, and houses of God became theaters of the devil's own making. The medieval monastery. In popular imagination, we picture peaceful gardens, illuminated manuscripts, and devoted monks spending their days in prayer and contemplation. We envision places of learning, healing, and spiritual refuge from the brutal realities of medieval life. But this romanticized vision couldn't be further from the truth. Behind those towering walls, beneath the chanting and the incense, a different reality festered like a wound in the very heart of Christendom. These weren't just isolated incidents or occasional lapses in judgment. This was systematic corruption, endemic violence, and moral decay that rotted the foundations of medieval religious life. The monastery was supposed to be a microcosm of heaven on earth. Instead, it became a breeding ground for the very sins it claimed to combat. And the most terrifying part? The Church's own records, hidden for centuries, tell us everything we need to know about these dark secrets. To understand how monasteries became cesspools of corruption, we need to examine the perfect storm of conditions that made such horrors possible. First, consider the isolation. Medieval monasteries were deliberately built in remote locations, cut off from the outside world. This isolation, meant to foster spiritual contemplation, instead created environments where abuses could flourish unchecked. No witnesses meant no accountability. No accountability meant no limits to human depravity. Second, there was the absolute power structure. Abbots wielded godlike authority over their communities. They controlled every aspect of monastic life: food, shelter, punishment, and even spiritual salvation. This concentration of power in the hands of unscrupulous individuals created opportunities for exploitation that would make modern dictators envious. Third, the recruitment practices were fundamentally flawed. Many monasteries accepted anyone who could pay, regardless of their moral character or spiritual calling. Younger sons of noble families, men avoiding military service, criminals seeking sanctuary, and those with psychological disorders all found refuge behind monastic walls. The result was a toxic mix of personalities and motivations that had nothing to do with genuine religious devotion. The economic incentives were equally corrupting. Monasteries accumulated vast wealth through donations, land holdings, and various enterprises. This wealth attracted men motivated by greed rather than God. The temptation to live luxuriously while preaching poverty proved too great for many to resist. Finally, there was the culture of secrecy. The Church's doctrine of protecting its reputation at all costs meant that scandals were covered up rather than addressed. Victims were silenced, perpetrators were quietly transferred, and the cycle of abuse continued uninterrupted. Let's begin with the men who held ultimate authority in these institutions, the abbots. These weren't just religious leaders. They were feudal lords with the power of life and death over their subjects. Take the case of Abbot Geoffrey of St. Albans in 12th century England. Historical records reveal a man who ruled his monastery like a personal fiefdom. He sold religious positions to the highest bidder, embezzled funds meant for the poor, and maintained a private army of thugs to enforce his will. When monks dared to question his authority, They simply disappeared. Some were found days later in the monastery's dungeons, broken and insane from torture. But Geoffrey's crimes pale in comparison to those of Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in France. Contemporary chronicles describe him as a man possessed by demons. He turned the monastery's scriptorium into a torture chamber, where monks who failed to meet his impossible copying quotas were subjected to horrific punishments. Fingers were broken, eyes were gouged out, and tongues were cut off. Yet Suger justified these atrocities as necessary discipline for spiritual growth. The Spanish monastery of San Salvador provides perhaps the most chilling example of abbatial tyranny. Abbot Rodrigo, who ruled from 1134 to 1156, established what can only be described as a reign of terror. He divided the monastery into different quarters based on his personal preferences for the monks. Those who pleased him sexually lived in luxury, while those who resisted were confined to underground cells where they slowly starved to death. Rodrigo's most notorious crime involved the monastery's library. When a young monk named Brother Thomas discovered ancient texts that contradicted the abbot's heretical teachings, Rodrigo had him burned alive in the very library he had tried to protect. The other monks were forced to watch as their brother screamed in agony, his flesh melting from his bones while priceless manuscripts fueled the flames. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of systematic abuse that characterized many medieval monasteries. The position of abbot attracted men who craved power and control, and the church's hierarchical structure gave them the tools to exercise both without restraint. Perhaps no aspect of monastic corruption was more widespread or more devastating than the sexual abuse that occurred within monastery walls. The vow of celibacy, meant to purify the soul, instead created a pressure cooker of repressed sexuality that exploded in the most destructive ways imaginable. The recruitment of child oblates, boys as young as 7 offered to monasteries by their families, created a ready supply of victims for predatory monks. These children, completely dependent on the monastery for survival, were helpless against abuse. They were told that resistance to their superiors was resistance to God himself, a theological manipulation that left them psychologically shattered. The Abbey of Cluny, one of the most prestigious monasteries in medieval Europe, was revealed through secret papal investigations to be a center of systematic child abuse. The inquiry, conducted in 1132, uncovered a network of monks who had turned the monastery's dormitories into hunting grounds for young victims. The investigation documented cases of boys as young as 8 being raped repeatedly by multiple monks, often during supposed religious ceremonies. What makes these crimes even more horrifying is how they were institutionalized. Senior monks initiated newcomers into these practices as part of their spiritual education. They taught young monks that sexual submission to their superiors was a form of religious obedience, a twisted theology that justified the most heinous acts imaginable. The monastery of Monte Cassino, the birthplace of the Benedictine order, became infamous for its night rituals. According to testimonies preserved in Vatican archives, these ceremonies involved the ritualistic abuse of novices as part of their initiation into the monastery's inner circle. Boys who survived these ordeals were forever changed, many developing severe psychological disorders that manifested in violent behavior toward others. Female religious houses faced their own horrors. Many convents were little more than brothels in disguise, where nuns were forced into prostitution to generate income for corrupt male administrators. The convent of San Damiano in Italy was exposed in 1198 when a papal legate discovered that the nuns were being rented out to wealthy merchants and nobles. The investigation revealed that some nuns had been forced into this life from childhood, never knowing any other existence. The psychological trauma inflicted on these victims was compounded by the religious context of their abuse. They were told that their suffering was God's will, that resistance was sinful, and that speaking out would damn their souls to hell. This spiritual manipulation created a level of psychological control that modern experts recognize as one of the most effective forms of abuse. The popular image of monasteries as peaceful sanctuaries crumbles completely when we examine the epidemic of violence that characterized many of these institutions. Far from being havens of nonviolence, monasteries often resembled battlefields where murder, torture, and brutality were commonplace. The root of this violence lay in the hierarchical structure of monastic life and the absolute authority it granted to superiors. When combined with the isolation of monastery life and the lack of external oversight, this created conditions where violent men could exercise their cruelty without fear of consequences. The monastery of Reichenau in Germany provides a particularly disturbing example. Chronicles from the 11th century describe a place where monks routinely tortured and murdered their fellows over doctrinal disputes. The monastery's well was discovered to contain the skeletal remains of over 30 monks, many showing signs of violent death. Skulls were crushed, ribs were shattered, and several bodies showed evidence of prolonged torture before death. But it wasn't just theological disagreements that sparked violence. The monastery's extensive wine cellars had created a culture of alcoholism among the monks, and drunken brawls regularly ended in death. The abbey's own records, preserved in the Vatican archives, describe scenes of shocking brutality. Monks beating each other with iron candlesticks, stabbing with eating knives, and even drowning rivals in the baptismal font. The Irish monastery of Glendalough gained notoriety for its trials by ordeal, brutal tests used to determine guilt or innocence that almost invariably resulted in death. Monks accused of various infractions were subjected to these ordeals, which included being forced to carry red-hot iron bars, being thrown into icy water while bound, or being forced to drink boiling water. The monastery's chronicler noted with disturbing casualness that God's judgment was swift and final for those who failed these tests. Perhaps the most chilling example of monastic violence comes from the Abbey of Saint-Wandrille in France. In 1157, a dispute over the election of a new abbot led to a civil war within the monastery walls. The conflict lasted for 3 months and resulted in the deaths of over 60 monks. The chronicle describes scenes of unimaginable brutality, monks setting fire to the dormitories with their rivals inside, poisoning the water supply, and even desecrating the altar by using it as a butcher's block for murdered enemies. The violence wasn't limited to conflicts between monks. Many monasteries became centers of torture and execution for the surrounding population. Abbots exercised judicial authority over their territories, and their courts became notorious for their cruelty. The monastery of San Milan in Spain maintained a torture chamber in its basement, where suspected heretics and criminals were subjected to horrific punishments. The surviving records describe the use of the rack, iron maidens, and other devices of torture that would have been at home in any medieval dungeon. The corruption of medieval monasteries wasn't just spiritual, it was deeply economic. These institutions, which preached poverty and detachment from worldly goods, became some of the wealthiest and most exploitative organizations in medieval Europe. The root of this economic corruption lay in the vast wealth that monasteries accumulated through donations, land grants, and various enterprises. This wealth was supposed to be used for charitable purposes and the maintenance of the religious community. Instead, it became a source of temptation that few could resist. The Abbey of Cluny, at its height, controlled over 1,400 monasteries across Europe and wielded economic power that rivaled that of kings. But rather than using this wealth for its intended purposes, the abbey's leadership lived in luxury that would have made Roman emperors envious. They built palaces, maintained private armies, and engaged in the kind of conspicuous consumption that directly contradicted their religious vows. The monastery of St. Gallen in Switzerland became notorious for its innovative approaches to fundraising. The monks established a network of brothels throughout the region, taking a percentage of the profits from prostitution. They also ran gambling houses, usury operations, and even engaged in the slave trade. The monastery's account books, preserved in the Swiss National Archives, reveal profits that would be worth millions in today's currency. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of monastic economic corruption was the systematic exploitation of the poor and vulnerable. Many monasteries operated what can only be described as protection rackets, forcing peasants to pay for spiritual services under threat of excommunication. They manipulated religious festivals and holy days to extract maximum profit from desperate believers seeking divine intervention. The Abbey of Saint Denis in France perfected the art of relic fraud, creating a lucrative business in fake holy relics. They produced authentic pieces of the true cross, genuine bones of saints, and even miraculous healing waters. The profits from these fraudulent sales funded the abbey's lavish lifestyle while deceiving thousands of sincere believers. The monastery of Durham in England took economic exploitation to even greater extremes. They established a system of debt bondage that kept entire families in perpetual servitude. Peasants who borrowed money from the monastery found themselves trapped in contracts that made repayment impossible, forcing them and their descendants into a form of slavery that lasted for generations. One of the most disturbing aspects of monastic corruption was the systematic silencing of victims and witnesses. The Church developed sophisticated methods for suppressing evidence of abuse and ensuring that scandals never reached the outside world. The doctrine of scandal avoidance became a theological justification for cover-ups. Church leaders argued that exposing corruption would harm the faith of believers and damage the Church's ability to carry out its mission. This twisted logic turned the protection of institutional reputation into a religious duty that took precedence over justice for victims. Monks who attempted to expose corruption faced severe consequences. They were accused of bearing false witness, branded as heretics, or simply disappeared. The monastery of Monte Cassino maintained a special prison for troublesome monks, where they were held in solitary confinement until they agreed to remain silent about what they had witnessed. The case of Brother Augustine of Canterbury provides a particularly tragic example of this systematic silencing. In 1203, Augustine attempted to expose a network of child abuse within his monastery by writing to the Pope. His letter, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, describes in horrific detail the systematic rape and murder of young oblates. Augustine's fate was sealed when his letter was intercepted by the abbey's leadership. He was accused of mental illness, confined to a cell, and subjected to treatments that included trepanation, the drilling of holes in his skull to release evil spirits. The Church also developed legal mechanisms to protect corrupt institutions. Canon law was modified to make it nearly impossible to prosecute members of the clergy, and secular authorities were discouraged from investigating religious institutions. This created a legal sanctuary for criminals who had taken religious vows. Victims who attempted to seek justice found themselves facing the full weight of church authority. They were excommunicated, branded as liars, and often physically attacked by supporters of the accused. The social stigma of challenging religious authority meant that most victims suffered in silence, carrying their trauma to the grave. The establishment of the Inquisition in the 13th century added a new dimension to monastic corruption. Many monasteries became centers of inquisitorial activity, where the hunt for heretics provided cover for the most appalling crimes. The monastery of Carcassonne in France became notorious for its role in the Albigensian Crusade. Under the leadership of Abbot Arnaud Amalric, the monastery became a center of torture and execution. Amalric's famous declaration, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own," reflected the bloodthirsty mentality that characterized inquisitorial monasteries. The methods used by monastic inquisitors were deliberately designed to maximize suffering. They developed new torture techniques, including the use of psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and sexual humiliation. The monastery of Toulouse maintained detailed records of their torture sessions, documenting the progression of pain and the breaking point of their victims. But the most disturbing aspect of monastic involvement in the Inquisition was how it corrupted the very concept of religious authority. Monks, who had sworn to protect the innocent, became their tormentors, using their spiritual authority to justify the most heinous acts. They convinced their victims that their suffering was necessary for salvation, turning torture into a sacrament. The monastery of Avignon became a center of heresy trials that were little more than elaborate torture sessions. The monks developed a theology of purification through pain, arguing that physical suffering was necessary to cleanse the soul of heretical thoughts. This twisted doctrine justified tortures that lasted for days or weeks, often ending in death from exhaustion or infection. As monastic corruption spread throughout medieval Europe, it began to undermine the very foundations of civilization. These institutions, which were supposed to be bulwarks against barbarism, instead became centers of moral decay that poisoned the societies around them. The corruption of monasteries had far-reaching consequences for medieval society. Education, which had been primarily centered in monastic schools, suffered as corrupt monks abandoned their teaching duties in favor of more lucrative pursuits. The preservation of knowledge, traditionally a monastic responsibility, was neglected as libraries were ransacked for valuable manuscripts that could be sold. The monastery of Bobbio in Italy, once a center of learning that preserved countless classical texts, became a symbol of intellectual decay. By the 12th century, the monks had sold most of their valuable manuscripts to fund their luxurious lifestyles. The library that had once contained over 700 volumes was reduced to fewer than 100, many of them damaged or incomplete. The breakdown of monastic discipline also had profound effects on the surrounding population. Monasteries had traditionally provided hospitality to travelers, care for the sick, and charity for the poor. As these institutions became corrupted, these services disappeared, leaving vulnerable populations without support. The Monastery of Hospitallers in Jerusalem, originally established to care for Christian pilgrims, became a center of exploitation and abuse. Pilgrims seeking medical care were subjected to extortion, sexual assault, and even murder. The very people who had come seeking help became victims of the institution that was supposed to protect them. The highest levels of church hierarchy were not only aware of monastic corruption, but actively participated in covering it up. Papal records from the period reveal a systematic effort to suppress evidence of abuse and protect corrupt institutions. Pope Innocent III, despite his reputation as a reformer, was instrumental in covering up monastic scandals. When reports of abuse at the Abbey of Cluny reached Rome in 1208, Innocent ordered the destruction of all evidence and the silencing of witnesses. His papal bull, Cum non solum, established the principle that protecting the Church's reputation was more important than seeking justice for victims. The Vatican developed an elaborate system for managing scandals. Corrupt abbots were quietly transferred to remote locations, victims were paid for their silence, and witnesses were intimidated into recanting their testimony. This system was so effective that most monastic scandals never became public knowledge. The case of the Abbey of St. Gall provides a perfect example of papal cover-up tactics. When a papal legate discovered evidence of systematic child abuse at the monastery in 1234, Pope Gregory IX ordered the evidence to be sealed and the legate to be transferred to a remote diocese. The abuse continued for another century before finally being exposed by secular authorities. The corruption of medieval monasteries had consequences that extended far beyond the Middle Ages. The systematic abuse of power, the cover-up of crimes, and the perversion of religious authority created patterns of behavior that would plague religious institutions for centuries to come. The methods developed by corrupt medieval monasteries, the isolation of victims, the use of spiritual authority to justify abuse, and the systematic cover-up of crimes became a template for institutional abuse that continues to this day. The same tactics used by medieval abbots to silence victims are recognizable in modern scandals involving religious institutions. The psychological damage inflicted on victims of monastic abuse also had generational consequences. Many survivors became perpetrators themselves, creating cycles of abuse that lasted for centuries. The trauma experienced by child oblates was passed down through families, creating patterns of dysfunction that affected entire communities. The corruption of monasteries also contributed to the eventual breakdown of medieval Christendom. As stories of monastic abuse spread, despite efforts to suppress them, popular faith in religious institutions began to erode. This loss of faith contributed to the rise of heretical movements and eventually to the Protestant Reformation. The dark secrets of medieval monasteries serve as a stark reminder of what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of unscrupulous individuals and when institutions are allowed to operate without oversight or accountability. These weren't just historical curiosities or isolated incidents. They were systematic patterns of abuse that destroyed countless lives and corrupted the very foundations of medieval society. The monasteries that were supposed to be beacons of moral guidance became centers of moral decay. The men who claimed to represent God on earth became instruments of the devil's work. The institutions that promised salvation delivered damnation instead. But perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter of history is the danger of silence. The corruption of medieval monasteries flourished because good people remained silent in the face of evil. Victims were silenced by fear, witnesses were intimidated into submission, and the broader society chose to look the away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The monks who screamed in the midnight darkness of medieval monasteries were not crying out in spiritual ecstasy. They were crying out for help that never came. Their voices were silenced by the very people who should have protected them, and their suffering was hidden behind walls of stone and veils of secrecy. Today, as we look back on these dark secrets, we must remember that the capacity for such evil exists in every age and every institution. The only protection against such corruption is vigilance, transparency, and the courage to speak truth to power, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. The medieval monasteries remind us that the greatest evil is not always found in the obvious places. Sometimes it hides behind the most sacred walls, wearing the most holy robes and speaking the most pious words. And when that evil is allowed to flourish in darkness, it spreads like a plague, corrupting everything it touches. The screams that echoed through those monastery corridors should serve as a warning to us all. They remind us that silence in the face of evil is not just cowardice, it's complicity. And the price of that complicity is measured not just in the suffering of victims, but in the corruption of the very soul of civilization itself.